Module 8. Community versus Individual Survival. Our addiction to individualism. One of the defining aspects of Western modern civilization is our addiction to individualism. Many analysts and critics believe that individualism is what set the stage for the industrial capitalist growth complex. The emphasis on individual freedom that dominated the thinkers of the Renaissance era allowed for the common person to escape from the bondage of unjust, feudal relationships, which set the stage for his or her creativity to flourish. Adam Smith, the economist who best defined the ethics of capitalism, stressed that an invisible hand would guide the economic development of our society, turning individual greed into a collective good. It's actually quite a nice and comfortable illusion. All we have to do is follow our own selfish and egotistical desires, and society will thrive. Unfortunately, things haven't gone quite the way they were predicted. A couple of centuries ago, it may very well have been necessary to encourage the development of individualism. Humanity had suffered under feudal societies where kings, queens, lords, and a host of other masters kept the masses under their control. Promoting individual rights was perhaps the best way to free humanity from unjust relationships of bondage. However, what once was an element of our liberation has turned into an all-encompassing sacred mantra that is the backbone to how the economic, political, and social spheres of our lives are organized. Ayn Rand, perhaps the most emblematic philosopher and writer that gives direction to the idea of rampant individualism, unabashedly defends the sacredness of the individual by saying, quote, "What is my joy if all hands, even the unclean, can reach into it? What is my wisdom if even the fools can dictate to me? What is my freedom if all creatures, even the botched and impotent, are my masters? What is my life if I am but to bow, to agree, and to obey? But I am done with this creed of corruption. I am done with the monster of we, the word of serfdom, of plunder, of misery, falsehood, and shame. And now I see the face of God, and I raise this God over the earth, this God whom men have sought since men came into being, this God who will grant them joy and peace and pride. This God, this one word, I." The problem, of course, is that this devotion to the God of I is the paradigmatic underlying cause of many of the crises that we face today. The egocentric pursuit of self-interest has led to the consumer-oriented society that has pushed our civilization to the edge of ecological sanity. Embarrassing levels of inequality that led to civil conflict also arise from our narrow-minded search for pleasure and our fascination with the accumulation of wealth. Since the individualist paradigm is so firmly entrenched in the structures of our society, many of us are unaware of how this philosophical meta-narrative affects the way we make our livelihoods. In this module, we'll first take a look at some of the social, economic, and political aspects of individualism and how they are contributing to potential and imminent crises that could cause a survivalist scenario. From a purely practical standpoint, we'll question whether individualism is the best way to assure our survival during a catastrophe. Contrary to the majority of survivalist literature, we'll argue that true, long-term survival is only possible in a community. Furthermore, we'll attempt to show how community survival is not only the best option for when crisis appears, but also necessary for the task of rebuilding a more ethical and sustainable society. We will take some examples from nature and the history of evolution to show how cooperation has allowed life to flourish more than individual competition. Lastly, we'll take a look at why community survival is not only more practical, but also more humane and psychologically necessary for us humans. Social aspects of individualism. The change in the heart and soul of humanity has been characterized by an ever deeper and more penetrating individualism that overtakes every aspect of our lives. We've all heard a saying that man is a social animal. However, the growing prominence of individualism has led us to become more and more solitary and individual-based entities. We may very well continue to maintain some sort of loose bond of affection to family, group, or country, but what ultimately drives the decisions that we make on a daily basis is our devotion to self. Now, some people may argue that individualism has allowed for an explosion of wealth that has paved the way for a certain sense of affluence and comfort that shelters us from many of the assaults of life that characterize pre-modern society. The best-selling financial author Richard Koch believes that, quote, before the explosion of individualism in modern times, the great majority of people suffered malnutrition and disease when they did not actually starve to death. Individualism has fueled invention, the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and all the enterprise that has led to cheap necessities and fairly cheap luxuries, decent clothes, affordable housing, abundant food, and the mobility brought by bicycles, cars, trains, and planes. None of this was possible before there was a cadre of highly creative inventors, engineers, entrepreneurs, and knowledge workers, before people were allowed and encouraged to create and allowed to keep some of the wealth that they generated, unquote. Of course, it's necessary to remind ourselves that the comforts that came with inventions have been unfairly distributed, as 1/3 of humanity continues to suffer in wretched poverty. But even for those who have supposedly benefited from individualism, do cheap necessities, fairly cheap luxuries, and mobility constitute a sufficient reward for the loss of belonging that comes with commitment to entities larger than oneself? Another aspect of individualism that has radically changed the social composition of our society is that our identities are defined first and foremost as consumers. Zygmunt Bauman is one of the world's leading sociologists who has studied in depth the social aspects of individualism. He calls modern civilization liquid society and believes that this society is defined by, quote, the reality in which life considers highly what is transitory rather than permanent, the immediate rather than long-term, and regards utility as prior to any other value, unquote. These pseudo-values thus require us to be active and effective purchasers of goods and services offered by the market. As Bauman says, quote, being individuals is equivalent to being consumers, unquote. This change in the social structure of our society may seem subtle, but it undoubtedly has profound consequences. It means that we are customers more than neighbors, buyers more than creators, shoppers searching for the best deal, more than acquaintances who engage in honest and sincere exchange. This change in our identity obviously affects how we relate to one another and how we relate to the places where we live. We seek transitory and immediate pleasures, which are the absolute contrary of the lasting, permanent, and committed dedication that we have argued is a necessary aspect of the survivalist mentality. Furthermore, the rise of the internet has changed the fundamental rules of sociability. The rise of social media such as Facebook, Twitter, and countless others allows many people to have their social worlds organized via a computer. But these online communities fundamentally alter the very idea of how we socialize. They are communities of convenience because they allow us as individuals to decide when and how we want to communicate. If someone isn't to our liking, we can simply unfriend them with a push of a button and move on to more pleasing relationships. Lastly, one other social aspect of individualism that has retooled our consumer-oriented civilization is the issue of identity. In pre-modern societies, identity crises usually occurred during adolescence, while the individual was discovering ways to fit into his or her surrounding community and developing a sense of continuity that defined his or her distinctive self. In many indigenous societies, young men and women were sent out on vision quests, where they spent an intense period alone in the wilderness, seeking a vision of how their own unique identity could be molded for the good of the wider community. In today's world, however, identity crises are the norm because we are continually and incessantly pushed to transform and revolutionize our identities. Developing a constant identity would mean that one is losing out on the ability to experience the never-ending fantasies that our shifting world is always throwing at us. Thus, as Bauman says, people prefer, quote, light identities and fluid connections which involve non-binding commitments, unquote, so that they may move on to new and better experiences.